Apollo is a terracotta sculpture, not made out of stone. And we see this very active, sort of striding stance in this sculpture. What else is notable and perhaps different from earlier homages, incarnations of gods that we've seen, and what is similar, particularly to Greek gods? This one is not nude, right? It's closed. There's a different kind of a naturalism, of a sort of sliding stance that we see here. And certainly still some representation of sinew or of connective tissue, we can say. What kind of a smile does that look like? I think it looks like the forced cheerfulness, as one art historian calls it, of the archaic smile. And how do we compare this statue to others that we have seen, such as the Doryphorus or a chorus? Funerary rituals are an important aspect of Etruscan culture. And we can see the influence of Egypt here in terms of how Etruscans buried their dead. Often in tombs that were arranged along streets, in a sense, pathways. And these individual tombs were round or square. And they were slid inside, openings cut into walls. This is also the kind of arrangement that we will see later in the Roman catacombs. The spaces are decorated with, and again, echoes of Egypt here, stucco, right? Reliefs of, like the frescoes that we've seen, stucco reliefs of tools and of everyday objects. Here we see them more clearly. These are not necessarily the tombs of kings, but certainly reminiscent of Egypt. And here we see a sarcophagus for a couple, very likely, reclining on what seems to be a kind of a couch and possibly enjoying a meal related to death. Keep this in mind when early Christian art comes along and this combination, this conceptual and physical idea of the merging of death and food, and specifically how that applies to what? To the body of Christ. The Roman Republic at this time, here this shows Rome. We see that red dot in the left of center part of the map. The city of Rome had spread through military conquest. And by the end of this period, it very much does look like an empire. There were two branches to this form of government. One was the Senate, composed of lawmakers, and the second were what were known as consuls, different type of lawyer, so to speak, and this was the executive branch. Oratory, giving speeches, was a fundamental part of this culture at this time. And here we see the orator, otherwise known as Aulus Metellus, a politician, portrayed here in the middle of the art of public speaking. That was really fundamental, again, to Roman culture at this time. How do we see differences between this sculpture and, for example, the warrior? What are the similarities? What are the differences here? Oratory, again, is what? It's delivering public speeches. It's about the effective argument of a point in a public setting. We can think about something like a Roman forum. Friends, neighbors, lend me your ears is a famous line that echoes through history. This idea of giving speeches both in terms of what you say, its content, and how you perform it. If we think of our great speech makers through the ages, Here we see Kennedy delivering a speech. He was a very effective orator, as was Martin Luther King Jr. Here we have the head of an elder. How do we know this is an elder? Well, he looks elderly. This genre consists of portraits of statesmen that emphasize their age rather than beauty, and were quite common at this time. Age was something that represented experience and sage or wise decision making. This technique of depicting someone, warts and all, as aged and idealized, every wrinkle, every furrow in their brow, is known as verism. Certainly a very specific portraiture. We see very realistic portrait busts of heads, busts or heads of male relatives, and these would be displayed in the home, and when the politician who lived there was making a speech brought to his platform. It was very important for the Romans to connect this idea of an image with a specific individual. It was also a practice among Romans to create death masks, which are the likeness, a mask, a plaster replica of someone recently deceased through the application of wax or plaster to the face. And these masks, of course, were again capturing those very specific individual details. The orator that we just looked at is actually a bronze statue and an important example of bronze sculpture. A very life-size statue, right? A draped adult male standing with his right arm outstretched. He has the contrapposto. He's displaying the contrapposto pose, which is what? The shift of weight from one leg to the other and the axis of the shoulders. The orator is clearly a magistrate, and his posture also reflects this. He's wearing a tunic and a toga over it, which is the official costume of such a magistrate. And all in all, he makes for a rather compelling figure who embodies the idea of authority. What else is going on at this time? There's the phenomenon, the occurrence of the changing of the socio-political landscape of what is now known as Italy, but of the peninsula in this midsection of what is now known as Italy, right? And these sweeping changes that were occurring at this time were brought on by the boom of Rome. Fortunes were being made, a booming population. And this also, as Rome's territory expanded, the inclusion of neighbors such as the Etruscan into the Roman cultural, economic, political sphere, while some groups, of course, are resisting, feeling that they are being conquered, others gladly join this idea of this concept, this practice of a Roman lifestyle. The term of this particular acculturation is called Romanization. It means that cultural differences are less visible and they're replaced by a more homogeneous, by a more singular cultural model. The Etruscans, as they adopted this culture, in turn lost the specifics of their own art and politics and even their language. So the orator is very representative of this idea of Roman authority. If we went back and looked at him, we'd see that his haircut is also one very common at the time for a Roman ruler, leader, statesman, aristocrat. And certainly the idea of verism is quite apparent in his visage. As Rome's power is spreading throughout this peninsula known as Italy today, and even beyond, France to Spain, to other parts of the world, Northern Africa, it brings other cities under its power. And part of what it offers them by the way of amenities is water. Think about political campaigns. Think about how we are bombarded every election season with the agendas that a candidate is promising and promoting. Roman art is an early template, prototype of this kind of intertwining of politics and propaganda. And when we look at Augustus, the Roman Empire's first emperor, he's certainly someone who, as we'll see, invokes this power of imagery to communicate his political message, his ideology. Here we see an aqueduct, which is you can still find the remains of some of them throughout parts of Italy, various parts today, certainly in the old Etruscan and Roman area. This ingenious technology that delivers water to populaces, delivers water to cities. It starts in the hills and mountains where snowpack or streams start to flow downhill. The Romans constructed these channels, sometimes above ground, sometimes just a little below, using gravity. The steady, consistent decline of gravity to carry water from these sources and down the hills. Key to these aqueducts, and very representative of them, and some other structures, is this Roman or rounded arch. The idea of these wedge-shaped stones that we see in this rounded arch, called voussoirs, the way that these are kept together and how these arches are a method for Romans to span wide spaces. And this is, as I just said, the time when the Republic, the Roman Republic, does indeed begin to look a lot like an empire with its annexing of land and of people. Power is first concentrated in the hands of the incredibly successful general Julius Caesar, legendary, right, historically, who also conquered France. His nephew, after he is assassinated, Octavian, takes control and asserts his power and authority and continues, doesn't disrupt the old power structure. Octavian becomes Augustus, and he is legendary and genius at masterfully using this idea of portraiture for propaganda. How do we consider this statue? What is it? Contrapposto? Marble? Male, clothed? Very clean shaven? What is he wearing here? You can also compare him to other earlier male statues. What are the similarities? What are the differences? Here Augustus is wearing what? Armor with this sort of relief, meaning raised sculpture that depicts his great previous Roman victories. And on this too, we see Cupid, the son of Venus, and this makes reference to Augustus as descended from Venus. There are many examples and ways of how Augustus wielded this power. Here we see Cupid, as just referred to. And some other examples of this period not on the lecture guide. Augustus as the head priest. All different ways of what? Of reinforcing his message. as a young athlete. There's a short video posted for this week of the more recent realization that originally sculpture of this time was not white. It was painted. This paint faded over time. And with more recent reconstructions, this discovery is now apparent to us. A radically different way of looking at sculpture that for a long period of time, art historians and conservationists thought that they knew. With the technology, the ability we have today to study and to recreate ancient civilizations, we are able to see what a place like Pompeii looked like. Pompeii, as you can see, is south of Rome. It's actually closer to Naples today than Rome. And these aerial maps give us a very clear idea of what this cultured civilization looked like. It gives us an idea of the everyday lives of these citizens of the Roman Empire at this time. You can see houses and shops and baths. So you really get an idea of the texture and the flavor of everyday life. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii, burying the city under some 20 feet of ash and pumice, greatly changed all this, and houses were preserved. It's partly why we are able today to be able to understand the lives of the inhabitants of that time. We're looking at the house, the peristyle garden of VI. Notable aspects of exterior and interior views of this garden is the way that Roman houses incorporated gardens into their design, enabling light and air to circulate, to be part of domestic spaces. And around these gardens, you very typically see these columned, covered spaces. The idea of creating temples for the gods, Etruscan temples for the gods that were inspired by contact with Greek culture, and then of course change when they become absorbed by Roman culture, is quite key to this idea of religious worship and the way Etruscan temples were used for them. These were ritual spaces that were open to the sky and were used for ritualistic ceremonies. Just another quick look here at Alexander the Great, the great feat of creating this highly intricate mosaic that you have a short video posted in your module that considers it and unpacks it, as we say, in greater detail, the battle between Alexander and Darius, as it's portrayed in the House of the Faun. So this is the kind of thing that was preserved in Pompeii. It's another of these open houses, the House of Faun, like the House of VI. And again, this acute, really exquisite detail and masterly work of these mosaics, down to a warrior looking at himself, a fallen warrior, as if his own shield was a mirror. And the scale of these pieces, A few other examples of mosaics in the House of Fawn and of an outside sculpture. Some visuals of Mount Vesuvius. And again, what this garden, the House of Fawn, looks like.